Hi everyone, Angus Campbell here. Now on Sunday the 22nd of December, and managed to spare a bit of time to focus a bit more on the E35SS Fury. Last time we left it, we'd split the cases and got the crank out, and I said I'd follow this up with a bit more of an episode focusing upon the crank designs, because we've got 3 different cranks from various stages of the development. So we'll look a little bit into some of the differences on these. I'm not an engineer, so therefore, and I don't necessarily understand some of the nuances and details associated with the development of these, and I haven't necessarily got any documentation either with respect to the development of these cranks, other than the fact that the final iteration of the crank was a much different animal to the earlier versions here. So we'll go into those in a bit more detail in a moment. Firstly, I've got a few of the larger components lined up to go into the ultrasonic cleaner. Some of these parts are in fairly good clean condition anyway, but we want to make sure these are now absolutely spotless before we can begin the final build, getting the bottom end together with the barrels, and then we'll slot the unit into the rolling chassis and complete the build from that. Other parts, such as the gearbox inner cover here, are pretty grimy, so it'll be interesting to see how these come out. I've left some of the components in there which, actually we'll take the dipstick out, which aren't going to be affected by the cleaning, so the bearings for instance, but these other components such as that ought to be out. So we'll get that on the way, and then we'll come back and we'll have a quick look through these cranks. Right everyone, I'm back several days later actually. It's now the Saturday the 28th of December. So before Christmas, in the last clip, I was just preparing to clean up some of the aluminium components, and in the intervening period they've all been done, and there they are there looking spick and span. So we've got the 2 crankcase halves, the head, the barrels, and the gearbox inner cover, also the top cam chain cover, rocker covers, and the inner clutch cover as well. So we went a bit mad cleaning these up, and that's primarily what we've been focused on just before Christmas and just lately. So they're all done. So what we can now do then is, as promised, have a look at these cranks. So I acquired these as part of a stash of parts that I was lucky enough to come across from a gentleman that was selling these, having collected parts and researched them in the late 70s, and he'd amassed a good haul of them, to the extent where, instead of me originally wanting to get the show bike running, it was obvious that we could build up another bike, and hence that's how the Fury SS project came about. So there's the rolling chassis built up from parts, and at the back there you can see the original show Fury, which I've obviously focused upon in separate videos, but the original intention was to build up the engine in that, which doesn't have any internals. It was purely built as a show bike for the London launch of the 71 range in November 1970 at the Royal Lancaster Hotel. That's the very model there. But we ended up with successfully securing enough parts to build up a whole new bike, and hence we thought we'd do the Fury SS version, and that's what we're doing now. And two of these cranks, the old two, I think, from memory, and possibly this one as well. I can't remember whether this came from the same source now, or whether it came from a different source, but we are talking, you know, 20 or so years ago. So was it as long as that? 2003, I think it was anyway. So yeah, certainly 16 years ago anyway, so it was a little while ago. But anyway, I ended up with the three cranks. And these are all different. So let's begin with what I think is the earliest one, which is this one. And the reason I think this is the early one, and as you can see, it does have well, one rod still installed with its bearing, but I do have the other rod here. It came with rods, which is for these early cranks is extremely rare, and these were still mounted, so they're in good condition, as you can see, with complete with bearings. But the reason I think this is the earliest of these three cranks is, well, firstly, we know it's a totally different design to the later one, which we'll see in a minute. But secondly, some of the webbing here isn't quite as extensive as on the next crank, which we'll see in a moment. So, and we know that, although I don't have any documentation backing this up in my own sort of personal files, there have been one or two articles written about the fact that, with respect to the original prototype that Edward Turner designed and the first prototype redesigned Furies, then they did have a lot of problems with the fragility of the cranks, and the cranks actually fracturing. And that's why, firstly, I think the crank was redesigned to try and beefen it up, and hence this one. And what you can see immediately with this one is, if you just look at the strengthening webs here, they're a lot bigger. The overall dimensions of the crank are the same. But yeah, you can definitely see there the end to end of that web either side of the central flywheel has been beefed up. However, the crank pins haven't. Also, you can see with these two, just put it back to the original, you can see that they've also changed the design of the flyweights as well, the counterbalance weights. And I think this was to try and also address some of the stresses within the crank, to try and prevent them from failing. As I say, the failures of the crank is quite well documented, but how exactly these failed, I'm not sure. All we know is that they broke. Now, whether this was the crank pins breaking or the crank breaking around the central webbing and flywheel, I don't know. I've not seen any examples of broken cranks. But then when we get on to the final version, you can see this is a much beefed up animal again. Again, overall dimensions are the same, but the counterweights, central flywheel and webbing, etc., totally changed. And my understanding is that this really resolved all the problems that they had with the early bottom end issues. Also, what is quite noticeable when you compare these later rods with the early ones, which we can do here, that is a later rod, and this is the early rod off this, what I think is the earliest crank. Then, even though this one's got its big end shells in, what we can see, if we get this the right way around, is that, you know, regardless of the shells, they've increased the size of the big end journals as well. So totally beefed up that crank, and you can see that the central flywheels has just been totally redesigned, and now looks more like, you know, a one-piece approach to this, rather than a bit more of a sort of a piecemeal approach to the way that they were trying to address some of the issues. If we consider how these have evolved, then what, as most people will probably know, what BSA and Triumph used to do from, it's probably the mid-60s onwards, was that they would assign a P for, I believe it's project rather than prototype, a P for a project, followed by a number to define those, each of the projects, ongoing projects, etc. And the Fury Stroke Bandit was P30, project number 30. The first one, the P1, was the first prototype of the Trident in 1964, was it, somewhere around about there. That was a P1 when they started the P numbering system. By the time we get up to the Fury here, which was first designed late 67, early 68 by Edwin Turner, this was P30. And then some of the other models in the 71 range were P34s, P39s, etc. Then these were all the P30s. But what they also used to do then, with respect to the different iterations of that, of prototypes of that project, was that they used to assign a letter suffix. And I know that, for instance, that the show Fury at the back there was what they call the P30D, D for Delta. And we know, we've seen testers' notes of P30Cs being in the engine test cells over at Umberslade Hall, and I would imagine that with respect to these cranks, then you might be talking about P30A or B, and then maybe P30B or C. I would have thought A and B, to be honest. I think that's a very, very early crank, and certainly with respect to these two, with this central circular flywheel, I think these were very much based upon Turner's original design for his prototype, which again is pretty well documented about the fact that although it was fast when tested at Mira, it did actually break plenty of components in the process, one of them being the crank, the other being the idler, the pinion gear for the lower pinion gear for the cam chain sprocket, which was very, very noisy and would wear rather rapidly as well. So there we are, just a quick bit of history really. I know of other examples of these, you know, earlier types of cranks that are in existence, but I'm not sure I know of any running motors that have this early crank. I think all the examples of running Furies and Bandits, I think they're all based upon this late crank. And as you can see, it's not a straight swap. But anyway, there we are. We're starting with the bottom end, so I thought you might be interested in some of the nuances associated with Fury development, and you can extrapolate that a little further with respect to the cases as well. When undertaking the first build with all the associated machining of this, we did find that a set of barrels that I had didn't actually mate correctly with the cases that I had, and also the which way around would it be? I think it's the right hand crankcase half we had to machine, because we only had a blank casting as well. So you'll often find that if you compare two Fury motors, if you ever find two in close proximity or more than that, you'll find there's probably different, slightly different bits and pieces all over the bike, really, especially from the engine side of it. If you look closely at the design of the cases, the inner covers, you'll find little variations, and that's just obviously symptomatic of the development process, and when each example's parts were manufactured during the development. Okay, right. What we're going to do then is move on, and we're at the stage now where we can just do one final clean of this crank, make sure all the oil ways are clear, and then we'll be in a position to actually build up the bottom end. So what I'll do now is clear the bench, set you up on the stand, and we'll start preparing the cases and the crankshaft. Okay, that's the crank cleaned up, and what I've also done is just mounted it loosely in the vise on the bench here, so I can drop some oil down the feed and pressurize it, which is what I've done. I just put I just fill it full of oil and then put a bulb on the end here and tie it, and then gradually force the oil through. Quite a long while ago, this crank was cleaned up and flushed out before I started the YouTube playlist series, so I know it's pretty good. But what we can see, if we get a bit of light on this, is, I don't think you can see it too well here, but certainly on the lower side here on this rod, and certainly you can see the oil that's come out there from the lower journal as well. So we know it's feeding. And what I didn't mention is the fact that obviously these cranks have a slightly different arrangement with respect to sludge straps, in that the centrifugal force will force any slight debris down blind-ended holes rather than within a cylindrical tube, because of the way this is drilled. If you can imagine, let's try and explain it from this side on. You can imagine that with respect to the internal drillings, there's quite a few plugs associated with this. There's a big one there, but the important one is probably this one up here, because that's the diagonal drilling through the journal across to the journal. On the other side you've obviously got a diagonal oil way, but coming off that oil way is a main drilling that goes through the centre to there, and that creates a sort of a blind end, I believe, where any debris going through the crank would collect through these blind-ended holes, rather than on the periphery of the normal sludge trap through centrifugal force in that way. So a different mechanism. But having said that, these engines have a full flow paper type element anyway, so I wouldn't expect as much debris to go through the crank as maybe you would expect on the A65 twins that just have gauze filters. Right, so that's the crank ready to go, but it looks like a bit of a bomb's dropped on the bench here, because I'm just tapping out one of the crankcase half mounting stud holes because the stud is a little tight going in there, so I'm just going to tap out the hole, but also I'm going to just dress up the 5/16 UNC thread on the stud itself, and then we'll get that in, and then we'll be ready to mount the crank into the crankcase. Okay, that's that stud cleaned up, and with the die in the thread in the crankcase cleaned up with a tap, and that's just gone in with fingers now, so they're all in ready to go. So first thing is I'm going to put the crank in this side, which is the right hand crankcase half with the roller bearing end and the oil feed worm drive ends, and then what we'll do is we'll put some a light film of silicone seal around the join and the flange on the other side. As you can see, slight flange there, and then we'll press the two together and put some placement nuts on there. So we'll get on with that now. Okay, cranking on its timing side roller bearings, and now we'll just say put a bit of sealer around that join, and we'll put the right hand crankcase half up onto the studs, and we've got the rod on the right hand piston in the right position, so we can make sure it goes through that groove there. Okay, right hand crankcase half joint face has got a thin film of silicone sealer, and you can see there the primary drive side ball bearing in place, previously in place with its circlips on either side, but that's well oiled up. So we'll now place the two halves together and put the nuts on and gently tighten up. Okay, success. There we are, together and loosely tightened up, not torqued up just yet, but nipped up. Crank spins nice and freely, and the first test on that, there's absolutely no end float in that crank at all. However, there doesn't need to be, because this ball bearing on the primary drive side essentially floats slightly between the two circlips. Hence, when the left-hand crankcase half was machined, it was done so with dimensions that that meant that there would be, you know, a tight clearance on the crank, and expansion in the crank then is taken up by the bearing slightly floating in between its two circlips here. So job done, good news. So next step in the next video will be fitting the barrels. I'm going to fit these initially without the studs. We'll just use the liners themselves to locate the barrels onto the pistons. I've got various stashes of gaskets for Furies that were originally in the factory set. So as you can see, certain ones like this is the top cam chain cover. I've got hundreds, as I've got cylinder base gaskets, and one or two others that will require along the way. But others, such as the primary chain cover, I don't have a gasket for that, so we'll have to make one up. But anyway, I've got the requisite gasket for the cylinder base. Also a couple of gaskets for the sump plate. The sump plate is on, but I've noticed it needs its gaskets between the plate and the gauze filter flange. Also, what I was going to mention as well is, if I just move this out of the way gently for a moment. I mentioned to you that this engine does have a full flow oil filter, and again I've got several of these which should see me out. I can just get this lid off gently with one hand. I was just going to show you that the full flow oil filter is very similar to Trident Rocket 3, but it's not the same length. But it is a cartridge filter. We will get there. Here we go. And there they are, very similar, but nowhere near the length. Plenty of those, and air filters too. I think I was mentioning before about in the last clip about the P numbers, the project numbers. P30 for Fury, P39 I think was the 650 twins, P34 was the B50 I think anyway. But anyway, I don't know where these boxes were labelled up, but there were certainly sets that were provided to the factory, and you can see there that the gasket one is labelled P30. And the seat base on the Fury was actually marked P30 originally as well, but that's all but gone now, unfortunately. So that's where we'll leave it. That was the intention, to get the bottom end together, which is now done. So next episode we'll get the barrels on. Following that we'll go on to the oil pump and we'll fit that. And then we're in a position to put the bottom end into the frame and to continue building the motor up in the rolling chassis. So we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for watching, everybody. It's taken a few days, this one, to put together because of the festive season. But I will be doing another update, I think probably just before or on New Year's Day. And we'll also do an update with respect to plans for the year, which includes the Stafford International Show, when hopefully all the bikes will be there. But thanks again for everybody. Thanks again everybody for watching. Any comments, for any subscriptions, and for your interest. See you again soon. Thanks again. Bye bye.